Hey folks, welcome to Advisory. I hope you guys are all doing well. Today we're going to continue our series on Black history by talking about an idea known as systemic racism. We know what racism is. Racism is the outright hate towards a person based on their skin tone. And while there are a few true blue racists in the world, I would venture to say that most people aren't, at least intentionally, racist. Most people are good people. Most people get along with everybody. We all do have, however, implicit bias that we need to be aware of and watch out for in our own mind and in the way that we treat people. Implicit bias is the negative attitude of which one is not consciously aware against a specific social group. We probably all have some sort of experience with implicit bias, things that we have to unlearn about a group of people that we may not even be consciously aware of. While it may not always manifest into outright racism, we still need to be aware of how our own internal implicit bias can get in the way of treating people equally or fairly. It is this implicit bias that leads us to this idea of systemic racism. We're going to define this idea and discuss it as it pertains to America, but we're also going to have a moment where we look at Dallas specifically and how systemic racism has affected Dallas. To start this discussion, I'm going to show you a short video that describes systemic racism and explains how it affects real people. They're going to use the hypothetical examples of two girls born around the same time, Emily, who is white, and Ebony, who is black. And it follows what happens to them as they go to school, as they graduate, and as they enter the job force. And while these two girls are made up, they are based on a real set of statistics that show what systemic racism looks like in the real world.
You might think racism in the US is really a case of a few bad apples. A racist cop here, a so-called Karen there, a leader of a white supremacist group. You know, people who deliberately hate. But we can't blame racism in America on just a few bad apples. Think of our nation's problem as more like an apple pie, with the racial injustice baked right into every aspect of our society. Meet Ebony and Emily, two American babies, one black, one white, born at the same time, same place, but Ebony will not get an equal slice of the pie, and that starts from birth. Because of her race, Ebony is 3 times more likely than Emily to die in the hospital as a newborn if her doctor is white. And once Ebony and Emily go to school, while both girls occasionally misbehave, studies show they won't face the same punishment. Ebony is 7 times more likely than Emily to be suspended, and 4 times more likely to be arrested on campus. When the two girls grow up and apply for jobs, odds are fewer employers will call Ebony back because she has a black-sounding name. And even though Emily and Ebony will get the same college degree, once Ebony is hired statistically as a black person, she'll make an average of 25% less than Emily. So why didn't Ebony get an equal slice of that apple pie? It's because systemic racism is built into our country's DNA.
All right, so again, the difference between the two lives of Ebony and Emily, they are not describing what exactly will happen to every white person and exactly what will happen to every black person. But the statistics overall of the population of America show these disparities, show this gap between the experience generally of a white person and the experience generally of a person of color. She now will explain the history of systemic racism as it started out as slavery back when the country was started.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy white men needed land, so they took it from indigenous people and then forced blacks into slavery. To justify using blacks for free labor, the whites in power promoted a myth that blacks were inferior. And as Seattle-based author Ijoma Oluo points out, our nation's institutions, politics, and policies were designed against the backdrop of that money-driven lie that black people just weren't as worthy or as capable as whites.
Our school systems were built around this, our economic systems are built around this, our government systems were built around this. And it is simply that things were designed to uphold this story, to uphold this exploitation.
And even though slavery ended here more than 150 years ago, the racism that fueled it persists in systemic ways today. White Americans now hold 85% of this country's wealth. Black Americans, just over 4%, and Hispanics, just over 3%. People of color, people like Ebony, are statistically more likely to be impoverished, incarcerated, and face discrimination in healthcare. Emily may have her own barriers in life, but her skin color won't be one of them.
So again, it's not to say that just because these barriers are there that Ebony cannot be successful, and it's not to say that Emily doesn't have her own set of barriers. All this is to say is that race, specifically in this country, and skin color has been used by multiple institutions such as government and banks to keep people of color from having the same opportunities as white folks. To show you some examples of systemic racism, we're going to focus on two aspects of society. The first will be schools, and then we'll talk about housing. And we're going to talk about how systemic racism in both of these categories has happened in the great city of Dallas, Texas.
That's right, Dallas. We are coming to talk to you.
So buckle up.
Buckle up.
So as you hopefully know already, before the 1950s and the Civil Rights Movement, America, and especially the South, was largely segregated. Many systems in society, especially those under the government of Southern lawmakers, were segregated, and schools were no exception. It was common practice to have a school in which only white students attended and a school that only black students attended. And even though lawmakers at the time would say that this was a separate but equal setup, there was nothing much equal about it. Most often, the white schools would get a lot of funding and the black schools would suffer from a lack of funding. And when you don't have the same amount of funding, you're not getting the same quality of education. Further into the 1950s, people started to get sick of this and started to take to the streets demanding that the government integrate the school systems across the entire nation. Finally, this pressure was enough, and enough cases got sent to the Supreme Court that they declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. This was the case that you'll hear about a lot called Brown versus the Board of Education. This order outlawed segregation, and for the next few years, schools across America were integrated. And from that day forward in 1954, everything was great and everyone was totally cool with it.
Nobody got upset and everything was totally fine.
Is what I would say if it were true. But unfortunately, many school districts, especially in the South, took a long time and fought the government at every turn when it came to integrating their schools.
Mr. Hall,
You may be wondering,
how did Dallas do?
well, I'll tell you. When the decree came from the Supreme Court, this was the quote from the superintendent at the time. He said that Dallas public schools definitely will not end segregation. The opinion of the Supreme Court announced May 17th in 1954 was one of philosophy and policy and not a directive or decree directing that segregation be done. And the schools of Texas are operated under the laws enacted by the legislature pursuant to the Constitution. In Texas, the Constitution prescribes segregation. He also said that local school boards have no option except to carry on the legally constituted segregated schools as presently organized. So basically, he's saying,
You know, that thing from the Supreme Court, that was mostly just a suggestion. They didn't direct or decree that we had to end segregation. Plus, in Texas, the Constitution prescribes segregation. So we gotta follow the rules of Texas, y'all.
man, it really seems like this superintendent at the time was kind of a piece of work. What was his name? Let's see, what was the superintendent's name at the time? Uh-oh. Warren Travis White. Come on, man, what are we doing here? It's not a good look, Warren. You can't go saying stuff like that when your last name is White. Okay, all right, what else does it say? By 1961, Dallas is the largest city in the South and the last in Texas still maintaining a segregated school system. Oh yeah, that's good. That's good. Good job, Dallas. And then finally they got their act together, and in 1961, 18 African-American students would be the first to enter white-only schools in Dallas. And just 6 years later, in 1967, DISD would say Dallas has now been
desegregated.
Everything is fine. Dallas has been desegregated. Oh, what's that? Oh, they kind of lied about that at the time?
Gosh.
While DISD believed it had complied with the Brown ruling from 1954, by 1970, a man named Sam Tasby disagreed. Mr. Tasby lived near Love Field and questioned why he had to send his 2 children several miles to an all-black school when there was a perfectly fine school within walking distance of his house. But the school happened to be white. So the whole time Dallas is saying, no, yeah, totally, we're definitely desegregated.
There are definitely no all-black or all-white schools in Dallas. Thank you very much.
Which, of course, was not true. On October 6th, 1970, Mr. Tasby filed a lawsuit against DISD, claiming that the school district continued to operate a dual school system, a segregated system, which is prohibited under Brown. This challenge from Mr. Tasby would wind its way through the courts off and on again over the next 33 years. You couldn't speed that one along, huh? We couldn't get that done in less than 33 years? Then, nearly 30 years after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, in August of 1983, the DISD school board finally ended its fight against court-ordered desegregation by unanimously accepting the Fifth Circuit's upholding of Judge Sanders' desegregation plan. And from that time on, DISD would remain under Sanders' oversight until he declared it desegregated. So the school board finally agreed to go under the supervision of this judge, Judge Sanders, and he said, I will let you know when I think that Dallas has officially desegregated the schools, which did not happen until 2003. When Judge Sanders officially ruled DISD desegregated 49 years after Brown versus Board was decided. Ugh, I'm exhausted. So it was not, unfortunately, the nice, clean, immediate effect that took place when this Supreme Court decision was made. It took years, and in some cases, Dallas, into the next millennium, to actually desegregate schools. So when we talk about systemic racism and systemic inequality, these are the kind of things that we are talking about. It's an unfortunate truth that if you are a person of color, particularly a black person, that your great-grandparents or your grandparents lived in a world where they had to go to a segregated school that did not get as much attention and resources as a white school. And while we like to think of this as way in the past, these systemic injustices still have an effect on how people are able to live today. There was more than I anticipated to say about schools, so we will talk about the Dallas housing market next as we talk more about systemic racism. There are some discussion questions on the next slide, so please enjoy those with your class. Be good to yourself and others, and I will see you real soon.